Friends, our second lesson comes from the Gospel of John. Listen for the word of the Lord. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone who serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the movie Back to the Future, Marty McFly, a curious high school student, meets a mad scientist named Doc Brown. Marty uses Doc's time machine, which is an old DeLorean DMC car, and travels all the way back to the past, way back to events prior to his birth, back before the moment when his parents even had met. What Marty learns is that time is not something to be messed with. Things that he changes in the past, right, transform and affect what happens in the future. Marty begins to learn one of life's lessons. What is past is always connected to what is future, and what is future is always rooted and connected in what is going on right now in the present. Oh, with one phrase in our story for today, the first 3 words in our gospel story, on the third day, John's gospel puts us in a biblical time machine that transforms us and transports us all the way back to the first book of the Bible during the first week of creation. On that first week in Genesis, and for 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and on the third day of creation, God manipulated the waters, separating them from dry ground. On the third day, God created trees with all kinds of fruit with seed within them. In other words, on the third day of creation, God created grapes. God created vineyards stretching across the Judean countryside. On the third day, God created the possibility of what would be Galilee's #1 industry in Jesus' day, winemaking. And God created the possibility of parties, weddings, wedding toasts. Marty McFly would remind us as readers of Scripture that this past story of creation always speaks into the future. And so in John's remarks that on the third day there was a wedding, we also might hear whisperings of Jesus' future to come toward the end of the gospel. For the number 3 in the Bible, but especially in John's story, always reminds us of Jesus' resurrection to come. It was not on just any day that Jesus rose from the dead. It was on the third day. So this story of Jesus' first miracle in this small little town of Cana hangs on a thread between the past of God's creative power in Genesis and the future, God's recreative power at the resurrection to come. And as is the case with the gospel stories, a story carrying such meaning and magnitude is told in a very simple, very human, even humorous, everyday kind of way. So it was, says John, on the third day that Jesus and his disciples were invited to a wedding. I imagine it was quite a party. Cana was a small town just like ours. Much of the city's people are out sharing in the festivities. Jesus' presence at the wedding is surprisingly subdued and quiet. Apparently, he was not asked to be the best man. He makes no public speech. He does not make a profound toast. In fact, this may be one of the only stories in the Gospels where Jesus is far from the center of attention. Jesus and his disciples stand in the background, observing the wedding feast, though I do like to imagine that Jesus got on the dance floor a little bit. Weddings in Jesus' day were culturally significant events, as in ours, but even more so, often lasting 7 days. It was expected that there would be more food and drink available than could possibly be consumed in a week's time. And like my Midwestern mother taught me, and like the Southern tables that I have eaten at here, there is nothing more important at a party than having more than enough to go around. That is why the third verse of this story should send shivers down your spine. When the wine gave out. The wedding is far from over. Only 3 days in, and the wine has given out. The greatest fears of the bride and the groom have been realized, right? Not only will the party stop, but in a culture where hospitality is the most important tenet of human life, the couple's families will experience shame and embarrassment for years to come. Hey, did you hear the one about the wedding last week? I heard the wine gave out. If you've ever planned a wedding, had a wedding, been in a wedding, been at a wedding, you understand how big of a problem this is. The problem is so apparent that Jesus' mother doesn't even say hello to him when he walks in. Instead, she very tersely remarks, "They have no wine." Jesus' words back at his mother remind me all too well of the back and forth of me and my mother. My sisters can attest to this. In essence, Jesus says, "Mom, don't bother me. It's not my time to show off. My hour has not yet come." Of course, in John's story, Jesus' hour always means his death. And so yet again, we are given a glimpse into the future of Jesus' death and suffering to come. Like any good mother, Mary puts Jesus to work anyway. Because she knows, Mary knows who Jesus really is. She knows his power. She has faith in his ability. And so she tells the lowly wedding workers, do whatever he tells you. So how's Jesus going to pull this one off, right? I mean, imagine the servants sort of looking at Jesus with a surprised, incredulous look on their faces. What is this religious Bible scholar going to do about our catering problem? Jesus tells the servants to fill what John calls the Jewish rites for purification jugs, filling them up to the brim, asking them to draw some wine out and to give it to the party planner, who's called the chief steward. See, this chief steward, this wine and food aficionado, tastes it, and he thinks it is the best wine that he has ever tasted in his life. But there is something critical that he misses. There's something that he does not know. See, John makes sure to tell us that it was not the bride, it was not the groom, it was not the steward, it was not the wedding guests who knew where the wine had come from, who knew who the maker of this fine wine was. No, none of them knew. See, John makes sure to tell us that it is the servants, the lowly laborers, and Jesus' faithful, persistent mother Mary. They know who the great winemaker is. This is not the last time in John's gospel that the lowly will see rightly what Jesus is up to in the world. But what is it? What is it that Jesus' mother and the lowly actually know? Right? What is the miracle here? Is it, as many sermons and teachings I've heard suggest, that Jesus has taken something simple like water and has chemically, magically, miraculously changed it into something else entirely. Surely that is one level of the miracle, but there is much, much more. Sometimes in the Bible, it is the oddest, weirdest little details that pull the veil back on a story and open up a world of meaning that we have not seen before. In this case, it's the vessel that Jesus uses to transform the water into wine. John comments earlier in the story that standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. He very oddly and specifically tells us just how much is contained in those jugs, 20 to 30 gallons, he says. Now, even though I studied theology so that I would never have to do math again, for the sake of this story, I did some biblical arithmetic. Just how much wine did Jesus make? 6 jugs of 20 gallons equals 63 cases of wine, which takes 2,000 pounds, 1 ton of grapes to produce, which is 756 bottles of wine, which is 4,536 glasses of wine. That is, by the way, half of the wine a small modern vineyard in 2018 produces in 1 year. The miracle is not just that Jesus changed water into wine. The miracle is the amount that Jesus produced. How lovely and surprising that rather than go out and heal the masses, convert the doubters, or raise the dying, Jesus' first miracle in John's Gospel is one of radical celebration, one of care for a new couple whose reputation is on the line. See, this miracle is an act of extraordinary, extravagant generosity, over-the-top hospitality, gratuitous grace. Right at the start of his ministry, Jesus shows us that God's grace is not just amazing, like the hymn says. God's grace is ever-flowing, overflowing, over the top, beyond imagination, more than enough to go around, up to the brim, as John would say. Drink God's grace, and it will make you want to dance like you've never danced before. God's grace will keep the party going, says John. And it strikes me that we live in an age where we are led much more by fear than by joy. We are directed much more by scarcity and lack than abundance and grace. Maybe we wake up in the morning and we look at the news and we think, this world is so lost and devoid of joy. Maybe we come to church and we look at our pews and say, there aren't enough people here. I remember when they used to be full. Maybe we look across the street at churches who are worshiping and say, why are there so many cars over here and not with us? Maybe we look at our town and say, we are so helplessly divided. Will we ever make it through this as one people? Friends, we do not serve a God of fear and scarcity and lack. Our God, who made the vineyards, who kept the celebration going, is a God of grace and joy and abundant generosity. Look around you. Look at all of the new wine that God has given this community. Look at the building God has given us to worship in. Look at the friendships this church has brought together. Look at the new people coming through our doors hearing the good news. Look at the families brought up in the way of the Lord. Look at the prominent place in this zip code in the middle of downtown that God has given us to serve and help those who are struggling in our city. Look at the laughter and the joy of our young people when they come up for a children's message, or those who will play and sing and dance tonight at youth group. Friends, the wedding is already here. It's right in front of us. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. Now, if that were all that were contained in Jesus' miracle, it would be more than enough. But this is not just grace. This is gratuitous, over-the-top grace. The third and most beautiful layer, the deepest mystery of Jesus' miracle, is found not just in the amount of wine, but in the very water that Jesus uses to make it. See, those jugs of water that Jesus used to make the wine, those are the wash basins for the wedding. Those are for when the weary travelers who arrive covered and caked in dust and dirt can clean themselves up and prepare themselves for the feast to come. Anyone who makes wine will tell you the most important ingredient, it's not grapes, it's water. This is the miracle within the miracle. Jesus doesn't just turn clean, fresh drinking water into wine. He takes dirty, muddy, gross water. He makes it into something new. That is the miracle. My niece Michaela, who is 16 years old, recently went on a mission trip to Guatemala with my parents to build houses for people who don't have houses. It's kind of like our TWAM trip. On one day of the trip, women from the city gathered around in the town square, women who have never owned a home or don't have running water to take a shower with, women who work in the dirt with their hands and their feet all day long just to provide a little bit for their families. So my 16-year-old niece and her friends brought makeup and nail polish. And right there in the center of the city, they gave the women their first manicures that they had ever had. The women, feeling full of dignity and pride at their newly painted nails, showed them off for everyone to see. And out of the dirt, out of the grime, came something stunningly beautiful. That is God's grace. That is God's grace. So I wonder what is the muck? What is the grime? What is the dirt in your life? What is the chaos? What is the mess of our world that our living Lord Jesus needs to come and transform and redeem into joy? Because the good news of the gospel is that when Jesus' hour does come, when the end of his journey does take him all the way to Calvary, Jesus will die in our mess, dirty and alone. And blood and water will stream like new wine from his side. And on the third day, he will rise again from the dead, carrying our new lives with him. Friends, God's extravagant, gratuitous grace is for you. It's for me. It's for the entire world. Because God does God's best work in the mess. Friends, welcome to the feast. Welcome to the feast.